Okay, shall we get started? Thank you all so much for coming. I think that people will keep coming in as the talks begin. Last time we had quite a few latecomers, so I think it's just a difficult time to get to at 6 p.m, so we've got lots of seats for them. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri as the first owners of this country and the custodians of the cultural heritage of this land. I acknowledge the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have lived, worked and continue to contribute to our cultural heritage of this country. Welcome to the final public program under the title of Memory, Sound, Sight and Object through Theory, Practice and the Emotions. This is a collaboration between CCP and ARC Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions. We've worked with Penelope Lee. It's been a real pleasure, and we've been working on this series of discussions that allow practitioners from disparate fields to really rub up against ideas that would normally stay within an art exhibition. To me, it's always really interesting to get people who are very knowledgeable from another field and ask them to contribute to a discussion that would normally be quite outside of their range of expertise. For future reference, the exhibition that surrounds you, albeit in a slightly compromised form with the lights off, is an exhibition that explores memory in many different ways. And it's a nice context from which to hear from Professor Michael Saling, Nova Paul, and Professor Jane Davidson. As I put the show together around ideas of memory, one of the most enjoyable parts of the process was going off down rabbit holes and thinking about scientific and social and artistic and anecdotal ideas of memory. It's a topic that is so ubiquitous that everyone experiences and yet so vast that you can never really fully encapsulate it. Sophie Call, Rodney Glick and David Solomon, Siri Hayes, Nova Paul, Julian Aubrey-Smith and Justine Varga all touch on memory in different ways. Whether it's attempting to capture memories that are embedded in place, false memories through narrative and photography, or the unfolding of time through moving image, colour and sound. One of the things that kept striking me as I compiled this exhibition was the multiple pathways that you can traverse to get to a specific endpoint, in this case an exhibition. There's no set route or process, much like the neurological processes that we use to access memory. In his essay, which is in the catalogue, which is available at the front desk, Scott Guerin talks about the fact that what we experience when we recollect an event is not an unfiltered view of what's been stored in our brains. So not only do we filter things, but each time that filter can actually change. So tonight's discussion will be a nice way to put maybe some new filters on what's around us. All right, on that note, may I introduce the next speaker, Professor Michael Saling. His talk is titled Mnemonists, Amestics, and the Imperfections of Normal Memory. Thank you for such a tricky title to stumble over. As a professor at the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne and the director of Australia's first professional program of clinical neuropsychology, Michael is well placed to expound on the facts, misconceptions and potentialities around perfect memory, mnemonism, and the extreme opposite, amnesia. Michael is also the Director of Neuropsychology at the Austin and Heidelberg Repatriation Hospitals and an Honorary Professorial Fellow at the Florey Institute of Mental Health. This January he was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia for a significant service to education in the field of clinical neuropsychology as an academic, researcher and clinician. Thank you, Michael. Welcome.
Good. While it's warming up, this is my very first talk in an art gallery. I'd like to thank the members of the centre, of Excellence and the Centre for Contemporary Photography for being prepared to tolerate what comes next, because there's no way I can compete with Nova's very beautiful film. In thinking about memory, from a professional point of view and an academic point of view, I think of memory as something that is controlled by the brain. So for me, memory and the brain are almost synonymous, but there are some respects in which memory is not entirely reducible to brain function, and that might be something we talk about at a panel level. But as the organ of memory, the brain is an enormous system, and it contains an innumerable amount of matter in the form of neurons, in the form of supporting cells, and particularly in the form of interconnections between them. So the brain has 100 trillion synapses, more than there are stars in the universe. And because of that, we expect that it should be capable of enormous feats of memory, and we expect that it should, in fact, be a perfect organ for storing and retrieving memory. But that's not really the case. There is a very tiny organ within the brain called the hippocampus, and you can see it in context in the drawing to your right. I'll try and point to that. So this here is the hippocampus in context, and to early anatomists the hippocampus looked very much like a seahorse. This was the artistic sensibilities of early anatomists, and so it came to be named the hippocampus after the genus name for the common seahorse, which is Hippocampus species. The hippocampus, it's probably true to say, is the hub of our personal memory system. It's the most ancient structure in the brain, one of the most ancient structures in the brain. It's been around for a very long time in evolutionary history. From a structural point of view, it's very much more primitive than much of the rest of our cortex, and yet it is absolutely essential, necessary and essential for personal memory function. And personal memory function is the thing that makes us who we are. So everything that makes us human can be thought to reside in a system of which the hippocampus is a critical hub. Now, if the hippocampus is damaged, then the consequences to memory are extremely severe, and that would produce a condition known as amnesia, where personal memory is totally obliterated. In history, there are a number of very famous amnesics, and perhaps the most famous is this person here, who was known up to the time of his death in 2008 as HM, and most people who have anything to do with psychological brain sciences know all about HM. His name is actually Henry Molaison, and he became an amnestic because both hippocampi in his brain, the left and the right, were surgically removed in an attempt to cure intractable epilepsy. The operation worked. His seizures lessened very considerably. His intellect was undamaged. His ability to converse, to do many things was undamaged, but he had no personal memory. And he's been described as marooned in the moment, by a neuropsychologist who's a compatriot of Nova's, describing the fact that he has no ability to encode any information going forward in time and therefore has no sense of time passing. And when HM, right up to the time of his death, as an elderly gentleman, looked in the mirror, he was surprised not to see that face and couldn't reconcile the fact that there was an elderly man looking back at him. Another very famous amnesic is David Waring, the musician, who lost both of his hippocampi as a result of herpes simplex encephalitis. Very destructive to hippocampal tissue. And his wife Deborah has written his story and points out that every time he sees her, it's as if he's seeing her for the first time and falling in love all over again. And she describes his predicament as being forever today. On the other end of the spectrum are people who have an exceptionally good memory. And one such person is Stephen Wiltshire, who is said to be able to reproduce virtually exactly a landscape which is flown over momentarily from an aircraft going at an aircraft speed, one glimpse at the landscape, and is able to reproduce it in this degree of detail. This is Stephen at work producing his very famous landscapes. Now, his memory is referred to as eidetic memory. It's a visual memory which seems to photograph everything that he sees. When he was 3 years of age, he attracted a diagnosis of autism. At that stage, he was completely non-linguistic. He had no language whatsoever. As he developed, he would draw and draw but not speak and speak. And people thought that it would be a good idea to take away his artistic implements to see if that didn't free his speech from whatever it was trapped in. Didn't work, it wasn't a great idea, but at the age of 9 he developed language quite suddenly and is today a person with normal language. But the idea of autism is one that is strongly associated with almost perfect memory for some things, a so-called photographic memory. It's also associated with what we can describe as hyperconnectivity in the brain, and I'll come back to that notion shortly. Another very famous mnemonist is Solomon Sherezevsky, who was described by the grandparent of all clinical neuropsychology, Alexander Luria, many years ago. And Solomon was a person who, again, appeared to have a perfect auditory memory. He wandered the world for a while, or wandered his local vicinity for a while in search of a job. He seemed unemployable until Alexander Luria arranged for him to work as a reporter in a newspaper. And at his very first meeting with the editor would give a summary of all the assignments of the day, and Solomon was able to repeat his assignment word perfectly back to the editor, which caused a stunned reaction in the room and made it quite clear that he had an absolutely word-perfect memory. But when we listen to what Solomon has to say about his memory, he describes something which today we would call synesthesia. So on hearing a word, he is unable to remember the word unless he also tastes the word, feels its weight, and perhaps experiences a range of other sensations together with it. And as long as that occurs, he's able to remember the word without effort. perfect photographic, let's rather say sonographic memory for auditory information. But there's a problem, and many people say, I wish I had a perfect photographic memory. People we see in the clinic will often say to us, I used to have a photographic memory, but there's a problem. And the problem gets back to the issue of hyperconnectivity in the brain. So for Solomon, the expression weighing one's words completely eluded him, because for him the word weigh was so intimately bound up with the physical object of a scale that he couldn't dissociate the word, that set of letters, from the physical object. And whenever he heard the word, could think of nothing other than a physical set of scales. So a concept such as the weight of an argument was something that eluded him absolutely and completely. We can describe this as a persistence of associations in the brain which are really arbitrary, associations between two things that don't have a meaningful connection with one another, but which are nevertheless important for normal memory function, as we'll see in a moment. So someone like Solomon or someone like Wiltshire have a persisting store of arbitrary associations in their brains that they can't get rid of, they can't deal with in any flexible way, and so their memory system is, in a sense, locked down. And that can apply to object place memory. Solomon could remember objects in their various locations, and in fact develop the skill of remembering things by pinning them up against objects in his local environment, and then surveying his local environment and remembering a huge number of separate things. And this painting evokes that notion extremely beautifully, with all these objects appearing in locations where you wouldn't expect them to be. The difficulty with connecting a phonemic string, in other words, a word that sounds a particular way, with anything other than a physical object is another feature of this condition. And so that word pair and that word pair would completely escape someone like Solomon in terms of the meanings of those words. So because our brain is so vast, humans have developed a whole set of expectations about their memory system which are very unrealistic and would in fact represent pathology if they were to be real characterisations of human memory. The first of those is computer analogies. So the brain is a computer, we hear it a lot. People expect their brain to be like a computer and to have absolutely veridical recall. Some people behave as if their memory is like the 5-kilometre nets of a fishing trawler, just sweeping up everything that comes in their path and retaining them perfectly. And then the theme of this evening, the concept of a photographic memory. In reality, despite the vastness of our brains, our memory systems are actually fairly limited. Our working memory, which is the first stage in remembering something, is exceedingly limited. And one writer in this field has said that essentially in terms of our working memory, we really just sip at the outside world through a straw. We apprehend surprisingly little, and this incredibly important memory system can only hold approximately 7 items in store at any one time, and has the normal propensity to refresh itself almost continuously to get rid of all that information so that it can deal with the next moment in our conscious awareness. And that kind of memory system is based on something which is actually very unstable. In other words, electrical oscillations within a network which at one moment in time are coherent with one another, at another moment in time lose their coherence entirely. And much of our memory is in fact based on the electrical ins and outs of a vast oscillating network. So our memories are based on an organ which is continually fluctuating between order and chaos. And there is the concept of criticality in thinking about brain networks. In other words, that point at which we are sitting somewhere between order and chaos sufficiently to function. But it can also be argued that that fluctuating status of criticality is an essential ingredient of flexibility and therefore an essential ingredient of creative thinking. And if we go back to the concept of arbitrary association, linking things that don't ordinarily go together, when we're introduced to somebody new, the name and face connection is entirely arbitrary. If we drop our keys somewhere in a rush, the object-place association is entirely arbitrary. And these are the things we're most prone to forget. But we have a system in our brain which is able to pick these up very rapidly, and for a short period of time, in fact we pick up myriads of these in the course of a day, and for a short period of time to hold them in a highly ordered state until they're no longer needed. And that propensity of the brain is in fact the essential building block of our personal memory. So if you want to find something that you lost in the morning, by the time you've gotten to the end of the day, you've got to backtrack mentally, you've got to time travel through subjective memory going backwards in order to retrace your steps and find the lost object. But we only hold on to this for a limited period of time, and in the not too distant future it becomes chaos, and all those arbitrary connections that we picked up today might be gone tomorrow. So it's that fluctuation between absolute order and total chaos that confers on the brain flexibility, and with that flexibility comes creativity. So one of the discoverers of the structure of DNA, Francis Crick, was notorious for his very poor memory. He could never remember all the arbitrary little details, the names of the bases of the DNA molecule, and his status amongst other scientists was somewhat downgraded because he always had to open a book and refer to those. But he worked out the structure of the molecule which is most important to life on this planet. And so to end with the very old idea put forward by Arthur Koestler many years ago, that the act of creation depends on our ability to navigate flexibly between different conceptual frameworks which might never have been put together by anyone else. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Okay, our final speaker for the evening is Professor Jane Davidson. She's a professor with the Australia Research Council Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions and will present a paper titled Music, Memory and the Emotions. Jane Davidson works in the disciplines of music psychology and education, history of emotions, as well as reflective practice research. Tonight, Jane will explore the mechanisms in operation as we experience emotion while listening to music, specifically when the music is being used for therapeutic purposes. As a practitioner, she has worked as an opera singer and a music theatre director, collaborating with groups such as Opera North UK and the West Australian Opera Company. Jane, thank you. Welcome.
I've got this horrible conflict between my glasses and the paper and the PowerPoint and all those things happening, so it might be easier if I can just see you. Let me see what we've got there. Sorry, I just need to check. Oh, that's much better. There we go. It's me with a very untidy desktop. There we go. Oh, gosh, it's very pink. It's not like that on our screens. It's something to do with the projector that it's coming up pink. I'm just going to put my little timer on so I don't go way over time. So that's not me, but that's some work that we've been doing on history of emotions, looking historically at what emotions are or how they were experienced in the past and how they are now. And I'm so fascinated by what the two previous speakers have said, but in particular Michael, because there are such strong interfaces with some of the things I'm going to say. So I might deviate from my slides a little bit just to try and pick up on one or two threads. So I've only got like 3 slides or something, but my starting point, my premise, is that music is a vital technology for communication and emotional regulation. Look, I understand that some people choose not to engage with music, but music is a very, very pervasive feature in the human condition. There isn't a society, a human society, that doesn't engage in musical practices. So I'm a little bit interested in how those mechanisms work. And of course, we are aware that this capacity to remember music or use music in a variety of ways seems to endure when speech has died. That's one thing. And also, music is something that can give us a very interesting continuous presence, which I'll touch on now. And so I might also say a little bit about what music tells us about how memory works. So I might just do that in a little bit of a spontaneous way in reaction to Michael's talk. I actually know Clive Waring. He was a phenomenal musician. That was Deborah and Clive Waring on the slide. And he and Deborah, he was a BBC Radio 3 producer. He was a fantastic musician. He used to run a college choir in Cambridge, and his wife was a professional singer and musician in his choir. And so he had this encephalitis, and she found him wandering in the park. Or at least the police did, and they took him, and he didn't know who he was, where he was, or whatever. And as time progressed, he seemed to show some signs of being able to shift his knowledge from this kind of working short-term capacity. So he had lots of semantic things going on that you would expect in terms of habits and politeness and all these things, all these aspects of learning, cultural learning that we have. And but he didn't have the capacity to get new information into the long-term store. So he was continually trapped in this present. However, he did also seem to recognise over time that he had this condition and that there was something wrong with him. So Deborah was always wondering, is he actually getting new knowledge? But it seemed almost like these were stereotype responses that he was somehow reacting to. And what is particularly tragic is that he is, of course, this brilliant musician, and for a long time couldn't acknowledge that he knew how to play music. And so they would put him at the keyboard, for instance, and he would say, "Do I know this?" and then start and play octaves, and then start to play music. And of course, given a score, although he didn't remember, for instance, he couldn't recognise the royal family on a photograph, even though he knew there was a royal family and he probably knew those as people. So there were aspects of inconsistency in his memory. But the sad thing about the music capacity was that because it was giving him a continuous present, he was reading the music and having to look ahead, and using what Michael was saying, this short-term capacity we have to have about 7 pieces of information we can retain in this loop and get ahead. And when you're sight reading music, you're reading slightly ahead. And he could do that, and it meant that he was in this continuous present playing. And if he was playing Baroque music, which was his specialist skill, it often has repeat bars, and it says, go back to the beginning. And he just gets trapped in this and could be playing music all the time. So you can see, and there was a very remarkable documentary made about Clive by Jonathan Miller, you know, Jonathan Miller, the doctor and opera director. And Jonathan Miller called it the prisoner of consciousness, because he's kind of trapped in this perpetual presence. But what I find interesting about it is that the music gave him a moment of complete happiness. It was something that he was fully engaged with his mind. He was doing it actively. He was responding. He was using all that semantic knowledge he had about the codes of music and its meaning, and he was able to respond and, if you like, have a very satisfactory affective interaction with the music. So that raises some very interesting questions, I think, about music's function. So I don't even know what's on my next slide. Okay, I'll come to that in a minute. If we just go back to this a little bit, I think we find ourselves using music to regulate mood a lot. Yes, we can use it to enhance mood. We can use it to enhance our capacity to endure things. So there's quite good evidence now, for instance, that you will train harder and longer at the gym if you're using music that A, you find stimulating, but B, that is motivating and going at a faster rate than your heart rate, and that will drive you along. And so on and so forth. There are many examples of this. On the negative side, if you're playing loud rock music and you're driving the car in a 60 zone and the pace of the music is quite up-tempo, you're probably going to speed. There's very strong evidence that the rhythm of the music will drive you along to make all your actions faster. So, along those lines, let's have a look at what these mechanisms might be that underlie music, and in particular those that link it to emotion. Now, these are only one particular theory, but I find them particularly compelling. And they come from Patrick Juslin and Daniel Wastphal, and these are Scandinavian researchers. And let's just think about this, because Michael raised some really interesting points about, if you like, nature and culture. And I think that these are vital. And the starting point to understand these mechanisms would be that at the most basic level, we have certain reflex behaviours, and the brainstem reflex would be the sort of loud bang, and you would immediately react to it. So it's happening at a very primitive level of brain function. So, of course, if we look at what music is and what music does, it has a component in that soundscape of the brain stem reflex. Another one of these very hardwired features of music is rhythmical entrainment. And these are things that, of course, go beyond just music, but they are abstracted and used in musical communication. And rhythmical entrainment is something that we all engage in. If we're walking down the street, we will walk in rhythm with the person we're with. Yeah? So there's a kind of mutuality in what we do in turn-taking, and some of that has obvious biological reasoning, but of course it has been developed and has very useful social function as well. And just to sidestep a little bit, because I did have in the beginning of my paper, before I gave you the Clive Waring anecdote, something about mother-infant interaction. And there's been quite a lot of research done in proto-musical behaviour, so the kind of goo-goo-gaga singing that goes on between mum and baby, or caregiver and baby. And there is a very strong timing component to that. And so the give and take, or the mutuality of that conversational style, actually has a very nicely timed framework. So I have a colleague who's done some brilliant work in this field. He's very elderly now, in his 90s, called Colwyn Trevathan. And he has some remarkable video of premature babies with the dads kangarooing the babies, you know, the little 2 months premature, and they're in here in with the fathers, and the baby elicits the sound, and the baby goes, "Wah!" and the father repeats it. "Wah!" And they have this beautiful timed interaction until the baby goes to sleep. So it's this whole thing about the rhythm, the timing, and the melody. So these things that are proto-musical behaviours that then, of course, develop and sustain us and go into this more abstract form of music. The other thing is emotional contagion. This idea of empathy and contagion is becoming very popular, but the idea is basically that we mirror someone, and the emotional feelings are shared between them. So, for instance, if I smile, you're likely to smile, and so on and so forth. And so the idea in this theory, this mechanism, is that you find something that you identify in the musical structure and in the shared social experience with the people you're with, and you have this kind of contagious affect in context. And then, of course, we have things that we can make evaluative conditioning with music. We assign it certain attributes and certain status or whatever, and we pair those things together. And that comes through in episodic memory as well. We associate the music with a particular episode in our lives. So like, darling, they're playing our tune, that kind of thing. So we're identifying it with particular social events. There's another theory that says that human imagination is very tied to our capacity to use visual imagery, and that music might also have a very strong visual component as well. So when we speak or think about music, we speak and think about it very often in these visual terms of it rising or falling, or we see in our mind's eye. The idea has got some parallels with this idea of synesthesia. So we're mapping the musical experience onto other sensory experiences we have. But perhaps the biggest one that is very dominant in terms of the kinds of emotional responses we have to music is connected to melodic expectancy. And what that means is it depends on the cultural context, but the music we have has a certain amount of tension contained within it because of the harmonic building blocks of it. Okay, now some of those follow the natural order of physics, some of them interact, of course, with the cultural situation you're in, but you anticipate in context what's going to happen next in the music. And that builds a certain amount of tension, and that's either fulfilled or thwarted. Do you see what I mean? So you can hear a phrase going up, and you might think, what's going to happen next? Yeah? So you get an expectation, and then that generates, if you like, a kind of emotional heat, and you have your emotional experience in reaction to the music. So this is Uslin and Westphal's theory, that these mechanisms all operate in a very complicated way, and there are certain kinds of musical stimuli that forefront rather more of these than others. So in that context, it gives us a very strong sense of how music is drawing on all these aspects of us, and of course memory has a very important role in all of that. So where does that lead me when I've got 1 minute to go in my talk? Well, where it has taken me as a researcher is a fascination not only in how musicians memorize music and how we use and memorize and think about music, or how we use it in particular ways, but I've had a very strong compulsion to work with people who have dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and how they use music as a tool to have a continuous present, to have a tool that gives them emotional satisfaction. And it has been shown very profoundly that music is an incredibly useful and powerful tool with these particular groups. I would like to show you one tiny video clip of some groups. I've been working with 6 groups over the last 10 years, with the elderly actually, but also, sorry, can somebody tell me how I just get that to go full screen? Maybe I can't. Oh, this thing here, that's it. So these are some groups with my elderly people, but also some of the dementia groups. Now I just want to show you this very quickly, so you get a sense of these are actually these subtle cues. So what you have to imagine is very often the people with the advanced dementia just sit there, yeah? And what they're doing here is they're having social interaction, they're singing where they can, they're engaged, they're using their bodies to respond to the music. It'll just take a little while to come up. Can you hear that? We haven't got an external mic. So these are other groups. I've been dealing with disability and so on as well, but we'll come on to the dementia group in a moment. Can you see that? It's a bit pale, but... So I've not highlighted any of the social aspects, but nonetheless, we're coming on to the dementia group now. I'll just pause there. This gentleman here, Jack, I've known him now for about 10 years. He didn't really know any of the repertoire we were singing at all. And there is this notion that people with advanced dementia can't learn anything or do anything. I have to tell you that Jack has learned a whole new repertoire of songs, and he has a whole different experience of his life. And when you talk to him, of course it's very hard to get at the threads of what he's saying, but he says that singing was a very, very important part of his early life. And that I say to him, do you know these songs? And he says, oh yeah, I know these songs. But I know, in fact, that he couldn't ever have learnt these songs before. So that to me is just one case, and there are many within this group. The lady who was doing these hand movements, She has very, very difficult social behaviour. She's often incredibly disruptive. She comes into the singing group and she finds a completely different space. So she is engaging her mind. She's using all these features, maybe these mechanisms of the music I've been talking about, that give her this continuous, active engagement with the music. Oh, look, I could talk more, but I think there's sort of some of the take-home messages I want to give. It would be wonderful, in my view, to have everybody going from these pre-birth experiences with audiation, with the ear being the first sensory organ that's really active there before you're born, and all the engaging proto-musical behaviours you participate in crucially for your development in infancy, and unfortunately in our culture that's kind of sucked away. But you can see for some people, even if that's a 60-year hook back, it is such a powerful tool that I would like people, and of course there are some people here who are probably from cultures who sing all the time, I would like people to be singing all the time. Okay, that's it. Thank you.